Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Hazel Healy, environmental journalist and UK editor of DeSmog, spoke to Tank on exposing corporate misinformation from fossil fuel interests. This conversation was taken from the Oxford Real Farming Conference in January 2024.
So I'm Hazel Healy, I'm the UK editor of DeSmog, and we track the people and organisations who work to block action to protect climate or nature, and we do that in two ways. We have databases of people and organisations who have a record of denying science and spreading misinformation, and we have investigative stories that we run finding like examples of greenwashing or ways in which companies and organisations have acted in bad faith, and also looking at how they're connected to politicians, shadowy think tanks and sort of vested interests.
And what kind of techniques are you using to go after these? Is this kind of traditional investigative journalism?
Yeah, so we use a number of ways. So when we have a database, that's like a public, all publicly available information, and that's all sourced and backed up and archived, so that when you run the piece and the company might just delete that reference, you always have, we're like that horrible memory that you can't escape from because someone recorded it and preserved it for all time, whether that's like Nigel Farage's, record of denying climate science, or, companies that, what they've done to lobby against particular legislation. So we keep a record of all that, so they can't then come out and say, we're pro green transformation. So, well, historically you haven't been. And then we will go, so we went to COP28, so we had various stories we were running there, but we also were there to see, in this case, what big agribusiness was doing. So the big fertilizer companies, the big meat and dairy companies, who are coming under increasing scrutiny over the volume of their greenhouse gas emissions and their contribution to global heating. So they're just starting to kind of ramp up their defensive PR now in a big way. So we went there to see, to go to the panels to hear what they had to say, and see who was there and kind of what their approach was. So that's kind of on the ground sort of field stuff. And then we do a lot of, traditional investigative journalism, so freedom of information requests, looking at, documents, government contracts, looking at accounts, seeing who's connected to who. And then the other method we use is a kind of network mapping, where we look at organisations and people and the connections between them. So that might be if a think tank has given money to a particular political party, or who's on the board of that think tank, what fossil fuel interests might they have. And when you kind of link all those things together, you start to get a sense of like an ecosystem of, climate science denial and like how it's connected to politics. So databases, investigations, network maps, field intelligence.
And then in terms of like who, as you mentioned, like these big agro-industry, are we talking like a very few enormous companies, or are we talking about more of a kind of vaster, smaller network, or what does it look like?
So agro-industry is highly concentrated, and they're often doing mergers. So when we talk about big ag, we look for the 10 biggest in terms of market share in particular sectors. So that would be meat and dairy companies, grain traders, fertilizer and pesticide manufacturers, seed manufacturers, farm machinery producers, so like the whole, everything that's in and around industrial farming and the companies that are part of that. And also big foods like Nestle, processors, and to a lesser extent retailers, although they're part of it too. Yeah.
And so the panel discussion I came to was about agri-spin, which is the term used to describe the techniques used to essentially slow down the both the pace of change, but also maybe the rate of criticism. I was wondering if you could go into those a little bit, about those techniques that are used by these companies.
Yeah, so what we see at DeSmog is people really using a playbook, and that's the same as your tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry before them. And that's partly around sowing doubt around the established science. So they'll say, you know, oh, it's not that bad, or you've got that wrong, or methane doesn't last that long, and they'll find other ways to count things. They'll produce their own science, independently sort of funded science, to prove the things that are like most conducive to keeping the world the way it is. That's a big part of it. They'll also attack people who disagree with them, try to undermine them. They will also pay PR agencies and influencers to kind of promote their messaging, and they also will have a very disciplined and comprehensive set of messages that they all use. You know, there'll be big ag like CEOs and public affairs and sustainability staff will all be saying the same things consistently about whether, depending on their sector, but broadly, the problem isn't as bad as you think, and we have the solutions. On top of that, in the lead up to COP, we identified like 6 key kind of greenwashing terms to look out for. And one of the things you will hear a lot now is regenerative agriculture. And that's a term that's been highly criticized because it's extremely vague and there's no way to measure it. So actually it comes from kind of nature-friendly, organic, agroecological farming. You know, this conference that we're here at is the kind of people who practice those measures. But there were really big companies like McDonald's have got like regenerative agriculture in their net zero plan. What regenerative agriculture would mean for them is that they would have to graze cattle over like much larger areas of land. And the idea that they could do that, even want to do that or afford to do that based on their business model is like, it just doesn't add up. But people will be using these phrases, you know, and putting them in plans when there's actually no way to know if they're doing it properly, and very little science to back up that the carbon removals that could result from that will be permanent. So these are the principles like additionality, permanence. Are these measures they're taking to capture carbon, how long will they last, and will they overall reduce the amount that they're, you know, emitting?
And I imagine that sort of world is not legislated against, or like it's not clearly defined what these terms mean attached to like specific policy or outcomes. Is that right?
Regenerative agriculture is not defined in any specific way that it can be measured. But so that's a term they'll use. The other they'll talk a lot about is emissions intensity, and that's about producing, you know, milk or fertilizers, depending on what it is, more efficiently. But that doesn't bring any guarantee that you will reduce the overall volume of emissions. So that's another thing you hear a lot from fossil fuel industry as well, use the same kind of measurements. And they also talk about efficiency. So fertilizers say we'll do more with less. So we can basically carry on business as usual, selling more fertilizer, selling it specifically in the global south in areas that might not use it yet. But it's okay, it's not going to cause more problems because we're just going to use less of it. I think the thing with agriculture as well is that it's really quite complicated. You know, it can cause, in a way that you can extract oil and burn it, and that will cause climate change. There's no way in which extracting oil is going to somehow bring a benefit. But with farming, you really can farm in ways that are nature friendly and sequester carbon. But the big companies that are claiming to do that are not necessarily committed to doing that in practice in a way that will work, I think. Yeah.
And then, so these arguments in terms of, so it's the companies making them, who are they directing them at?
So in the lead up to COP, we had an investigation that we published actually with The Guardian, and that had the meat industry's kind of comms plan for COP. And so that was like a briefing that went out, put together by the Global Meat Alliance. That went out to all their members, and it included like a list of all the people who were going to be there. It included a PR company that was going to be there called Red Flag, and it equipped the members of their alliance with key messages. 6 key messages around meat, and it told them sort of how and when to use them. So they said, the best way to use these is with your ministers at home. Better still, if you can get an invite to COP as part of a country delegation, that's the best way to go. If you can't get in as part of the country delegation, you can sponsor a pavilion. These are our kind of partners who are sponsoring pavilions. These are our people who will be kind of talking heads, who you can kind of get on your panels if you're hosting any. So they kind of do it through individuals, through sponsorship, through individual meetings. And when I was at COP, the people who are linked to these big corporations were saying openly, we're going to get some ministers in here later. We're going to be talking about carbon farming. I've got to go. I'm off to meet a minister. So they just have the ear of the people in power. But when we did our mapping exercise, what we saw is that there were over 100 access points for big agricultural food and farming and processing companies. And you could see, so around the outside, you have the kind of McDonald's or Cargill, like individual companies. And then you have, in the inner ring, are either lobby associations that they're part of or initiatives that they're part of. And those feed into kind of various parts of the UNFCCC kind of architecture for COP28 summits. So they might be, speaking pavilions, part of like high-level initiatives with the COP28 presidency. And in all those places, they'll be spreading that message, like, it's okay, methane doesn't last that long. It's okay because we're going to feed the cattle methane inhibiting feed. And a lot of these solutions are like unproven at scale, techno fixes. So they're really relying on something that doesn't work yet to solve a problem that has to be dealt with now. Mm-hmm.
And those, like you mentioned that PR firm Red Flag, is this a technique that the companies are using to also not have their names obviously attached to lobby groups or?
Yes, there's a whole history of like using front groups or groups with kind of ambivalent names that you can then use to aggressively lobby in a way that you wouldn't. So the 4 big pesticide companies have a lobby association called CropLife. So they don't need to take extreme positions as companies, but their CropLife trade association can and does. And you see that across all industries. So the car industry is the same. They might have, Toyota might not be saying anything controversial about emissions or man-made climate change, but there might be a member of a trade association that can and does. So I think there's a lot of that. And then, at COP, for example, I saw a panel that was put on by the International Fertilizer Association, the CEO of that association, and Nutrien, which is one of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world. And they were there as a coalition for soil health. And that was their kind of route in, was this kind of initiative that they're part of. And, he sat up there, the CEO of Nutrien, and said, consumers aren't going to pay extra for a net zero banana. And that was all he brought to the table when we were hearing today. Synthetic fertilizers cause, I think, around 30% of the pollution from arable farms in the UK. So they're a huge source of pollution in agriculture. And he didn't sit up there and say, we've got a problem, how are we going to address it? This is how we're counting it. These are our binding targets. He just sat there saying, we need to tell our story better. If we reduce production, people's children are going to go hungry, and we need to hit people's emotions. I mean, that's what that panel said. They're not serious about addressing the pollution that comes from the products that they sell.
And how do you tackle that, like a very effective tool of like continually simplifying and emoting, I suppose, particularly because I think it's easy to do that in a way around food, as you say. It's easy to talk about broadly about mass hunger or about preferences, and there's always a compression down into these very simple ideas. How do you keep it complex?
So what I often try to do as a writer and editor is juxtapose things that help the reader to see how and why this argument has been made in bad faith. So if you show what that person, representative from Nutrien, said on that panel, and then you talk about the pollution that's caused by nitrogen fertilizers. I mean, the fact that they didn't even bring that up is like relevant, right? But I think, so you have to come back all the time. What you must never stop doing is explaining the impact. So you're talking about biodiversity loss, dangerous levels of climate change, and the products that these companies make are causing these things. So you have to remind people constantly why this is important and what is happening now and will continue to happen unless it changes. So I think another way that you can complicate it is to bring in a company's lobbying record, because that will help sharpen the focus. So if they talk about supporting green targets, but you have evidence that they've lobbied against them, that helps to complicate matters. The other thing we try to do at DeSmog is we publish with bigger media partners so that we're hopefully not just reaching the people who already worry about these things and have a position on these things, but say readers of the Financial Times or the Times or Politico who might be less familiar with the problems to do with this industry.
And what are you seeing at the moment in the last year or at the last COP? You know, what's new in this world at the moment?
What we're seeing now is that there's an increased focus on agribusiness. So we know that agriculture causes around a third of emissions, food systems in total kind of similar. We know that livestock drives around a third of methane emissions globally. So there's much more focus now on greenhouse gas emissions from that sector in a way that there wasn't before. The focus used to be on transport and energy. So that's new. And we also know that without any action on food, so even if you stopped all the emissions from energy and transport, we would still go over 1.5 degrees warming from food systems emissions alone. And so I think the evidence is starting to build that we're beginning to realize that this isn't like a secondary nice to have, it's like an essential part of tackling climate change and the biodiversity crisis, which they're coming together and you have to tackle them together. So as a result of that, you're seeing massive pushback from these companies. So we counted the number of agribusiness delegates who went to COP last year compared to this year, which is harder than it sounds, from a list of this year over 80,000 delegates. And we saw that agribusiness delegates had doubled, but overall the delegates had doubled as well. So that's less statistically relevant, but the meat and dairy delegates had tripled. And we also counted 26 CEOs who went to COP, which is they're really sending their big guns to come and defend. And sadly, that is what they're there to do, defend the polluting status quo. So they're sending more people, they're focusing on this, and they're really cranking out the arguments. It's like the op-eds, the meetings with ministers, the lobbyists working hard already in places like Brussels to kind of push back green legislation. Yeah, it's a bit, and unfortunately they've had some real successes as well in slowing things down. Yeah.
And is that also, I mean, there's another way to account for that kind of ramping up also because they're in a very precarious situation financially. There's so much animal product in goods that you don't think there's animal product in. Even a minor shift away from that would threaten the entire American dairy industry, for instance, if companies are looking to take out powdered milk from products that people don't expect powdered milk to be in. Do you think that this is also a response to a very fragile, though enormous, set of industries? Or is that too hopeful?
And that argument's used for fossil fuels a lot, that this is like an outdated system and people need to make the change. So it could be a response to risk. I tend to see it more as them just wanting to carry on making as much money as possible. I mean, then maybe that's cynical. I think there's like a real resistance to change, and anything that will affect profit margins is my kind of instinctive answer to that. But yes, there are huge implications of dietary change. But I've also seen studies or opinions where people say it's not about less, it's about better. And if you adopt these measures, then you can sell your product potentially for more money, but people eat less of it, but they'll pay more for it. You know, you may find that you can still be profitable and farm in a way that is nature friendly. If you're McDonald's, I mean, maybe not. Maybe there's a scale issue, but I think people are resistant to change anyway, and these big companies I think are fighting for their bottom line, and the other thing they're fighting for actually is public investment, because they're arguing for funds. They're trying to get their hands on funds from government to develop some of the kind of technological solutions that will kind of avoid them basically cutting production. But it really does feel like it's a race at the moment to get the right ideas on the table. So if you, at COP28, the language that these companies and their representatives or like industry-friendly scientists are using, talk about climate neutrality, to listen to them, you know, they have people up there, I ranch for the climate, I ranch for the butterflies, you know, using these examples like biodiversity, but they're like, they cherry pick the facts. So to listen to them, you think, wow, we just don't have a problem here. And then you come to a conference like this in Oxford, the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and there are people who also make a living from farming, who are genuinely interested in protecting the environment and mitigating their carbon emissions. And the first thing they do is acknowledge they have a problem and start to talk honestly about how to address it. And I just haven't seen that from anyone who I've heard speak from the kind of corporate side at these events. It's all defensive, it's all PR, it's all spin.
You know, this conference represents a convergence of people who are anxious about climate change in its broader sense. And then, you know, what you're describing is a very highly organised but also huge group of people doing precisely the opposite. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just wonder, like, how much of your time do you spend thinking about the people that you're up against on a kind of human level and what it is motivating people? I mean, do you think it's a genuine belief that what they're doing is the right way to like feed people and planet?
Yeah, I often ask myself that question. I think with food it's maybe more complicated than with fossil fuels, because I think it is a nuanced picture in many ways, but it's hard not to see it very cynically. In the, you know, the Nutrien CEO is earning $8 million a year, so you know he's put there by people who want to continue making money from selling fertilizers. So that is one way to look at it. I also think there are like two kind of different models and ways of seeing the world, and there is this productivist narrative that, you know, ties into capitalism, that the more you produce, the cheaper you produce it, more people will be able to eat. But like, I don't know to what extent you can continue to ignore the negative externalities of that model, or the fact that putting things in the hands of corporations means that the individual people who used to be responsible for like growing their own food or rearing their own animals will no longer be doing that, will be disenfranchised or lose their land, and how safe it is in the wake of a crisis like COVID or the changes that are coming in a warming world to rely on like a vast international supply chain. So yes, they may be asking the wrong questions. I went to a talk about scientists whose work was funded by pesticide companies, and the campaigner who's talking about that phenomenon said that it's not that they're bad people, but they're asking the wrong questions. You know, so they're not thinking about access, distribution, power. And actually, when I was at COP28, and one of the things we also do is when we're in those spaces, this is about accountability. That's what DeSmog is here for. So I did also like ask difficult questions, you know, from the floor in those panels. And afterwards, you know, I would get swarmed by like lobby groups who were like, great question. Like, really? Why did you? I was talking to one woman from Beef and Lamb, New Zealand. She's talking about GWP star, which is this kind of tricksy way of measuring methane that kind of lets big polluters off the hook in the global north. she seemed quite genuine afterwards. I was thinking I could just send her that really good paper by such and such, but I was like, I don't think they're really interested. But I did also hope, like, being here, I actually might send some of the people I met, who I'm sure were just trying to neutralize me, because that is also like, that's what you're told to do in PR. It's like a standard thing that you do for people who are potentially, problematic. But yeah, instinctively I want to send them the carbon farming session from today, a link to the session, and be like, this is what, if you were genuinely interested in kind of sequestering carbon, these are the kind of questions you'd need to be asking yourself, and these are the kind of ethical boundaries you would put across it. So people speaking today were saying, I won't sell a carbon credit to anyone who hasn't already demonstrated that they have reduced their emissions by 50%. Like, what an amazing benchmark, right? Or I won't sell any carbon credits until I've cancelled out the emissions on my own farm. So I'm not doing this to make money, I'm doing this as a genuine way to reduce the amount of pollution that I put into the atmosphere. So if you could take that genuine integrity that other people who also rely on farming for a living, this isn't Greenpeace, this isn't an NGO, this is a farmer who's genuinely wanting to tackle these problems. And I would love those people to be in the room, but I think it's in their job description to fight for their business model, unfortunately. Yeah. Well, you live in hope.
We live in hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.